Earlier this week, I put on my black clerical vestments to stand on a street corner in our late August summer heat to be a part of a demonstration against our governor's efforts to cut funding to Medicaid, leaving more than 100,000 Missouri children without health care. I don't typically wear clerical garb even here at church, but I found that if I put on a collar when I go to a protest, it cuts down on the number of people who shout obscenities at us as they drive by, and it cuts down on the number of pickup truck drivers who lift a single middle finger to announce their IQ as they respond to our presentation. But one brave, patriotic American did use his time at the stoplight to repeatedly yell at me, "For free? You want to give everyone health care for free?" It's difficult to have a meaningful conversation with someone at a noisy intersection where more than 60,000 cars pass every day. But even shortly after my time baking on the sidewalks, I attended a dinner at which I was seated across from a man who is a cancer patient. And he talked passionately about his fight for life against the poor health care that he had received locally, being forced to travel to a cancer center in Texas. He peppered his narrative with repeated assertions that Obamacare messed up health care in America, and ever since Obamacare, health care stinks. Again, he's a cancer patient. I didn't want to argue with him, but honestly, for people like that, debate is usually just a shouting match, since obviously his views were not predicated on any information. But both the man yelling at me from his car and the man wolfing down those delicious tacos are symptomatic of a problem that we have in America with being terrified about the prospect of someone who might get something of value, without paying for it. Without knowing much about what the word means, they assume that every public program is socialism. Excuse me. Just a little bit low on coffee. But while the right uses socialism as a scare word whenever a public benefit is mentioned, you got to admit the left is not entirely innocent of using the term incorrectly as well. I'm generally very fond of the videos and social media posts produced by Robert Reich, the former labor secretary under President Bill Clinton. His charts, his succinct lectures on economics and employment are very instructional. But I got to tell you, even a mountain goat stumbles sometimes. Reich posted this meme that would have you believe that Republicans tried to scare people to keep Franklin Roosevelt from starting Social Security in the 1940s, and in the 1960s to keep Lyndon Johnson from starting Medicare. While there was considerable conservative opposition to both programs, they were both eventually passed with bipartisan participation. These buttons were made to look like this is what Republicans always do, and in fact, these buttons were fabricated in 2009. They did not exist during the Johnson and Roosevelt administrations. The partisan divide that has so paralyzed our current government is, I think, worse than any time in the past century. The man at dinner who was certain that he got better health care when 80 million Americans didn't have access to health care might not have been concerned if he had known that I was one of those 80 million who is now on some form of Obamacare, so that if I have the misfortune of discovering that I might have cancer, I would at least have access to the same horrible care he is now receiving. You would think that someone who is a cancer patient would want everyone who has cancer to get appropriate care. And I would even go out on a limb and suspect that this patient I met is not a bad guy. He's probably a pretty normal, upstanding fellow. But he has been trained by the polarization of our political rhetoric of the day to dehumanize those of us who didn't end up working for a large corporation that has great health care. You all are not bad people, but you don't provide health care for me as the only full-time employee of this church. It is impossible for a church to compete with large corporations. So Obamacare is an option for me to have decent health care coverage that I wouldn't have access to otherwise. Now, what I want you to go home today having heard me say is that almost everyone that you hear using the term socialism as a scare word doesn't have the slightest idea what socialism is. And everyone who assumes that our budget pockets are bottomless, such that the government could pay for everything, simply doesn't understand economics. America has a blended economic system. Some of it is private and some of it is public. The current problem is that our economic system has been manipulated to redistribute wealth upward, which is going to destroy capitalism if it goes on. It will also destroy public services if we do not correct course. My own belief is that the course correction needs to be dramatic and it needs to come pretty soon. So there's either a violent revolution or there's a peaceful revolution, but our national economic system will not sustain itself the way that it is going. And as President Kennedy observed years ago, those who prevent peaceful revolution make violent revolution necessary. So we can either be smart in changing our economic system and doing it peacefully, or we can wait until the desperation reaches the stage of violent public revolution. Now, I sometimes meet with the parents of young men who are in who have sons who are in federal prisons. And one of these very passionate and loving fathers is an avid Trump supporter who, before I blocked him on social media, used to constantly send me videos and articles from right-wingers who are condemning socialism. What I always love is when someone like that is talking down to me and telling me how stupid I am. I'm like, let's compare resumes. But in a quiet moment after a support group meeting over a cold beer, I pointed out to him, you are a city bus driver. And our bus system is owned by City Utilities, which is a publicly owned utility company. Ergo, as we say in logic classes, you are paid through a socialist institution. I, on the other hand, started a not-for-profit that receives no tax funds and is supported by the donations of its consumers. So you're a socialist and I'm a capitalist. And as happens so often in these sorts of exchanges, none of what I said made any difference at all. It reminded me very much of the first episode of The Chappelle Show, in which Dave Chappelle did a skit where he played a blind black man who was a rabid member of the KKK. My bus driving friend left our encounter hating socialists and refusing to recognize that he is one. But before anyone feels the need to prove to me that they also went to high school, I understand that the terms socialism and capitalism are not being used in a technically correct way in our political dialogue. What we're really talking about is the divide between what is paid for individually and what is paid for corporately. Even people who have good health insurance, if you talk about socialism as what is paid for corporately, no one, unless you were super rich, could afford to get cancer and pay for it out of your pocket. Insurance is always a collectivizing of experience. It's a matter of shared risk. So whether you share it across society or you share it across a large corporation, it is still what we really mean by a socialist or public system. For example, the cost of public schools, kindergarten through 12th grade. We understand that our society needs to have an educated populace. So we pay corporately for kindergarten through 12th grade, largely through property taxes. In a more convoluted way, we contribute to the cost of state universities and to a lesser degree through some private colleges, scholarship programs, and trade schools. But somehow people have been taught to think that kindergarten through 12th grade being supported by the public is just what you do. That's God ordained. But if you try to add 4 years to that, that makes the whole system socialist. Whether you personally go to college or not, you get to live in a better society if the people who, for example, will take care of you when you get cancer and you go to the hospital, if they went to college. Whether it's a trade school or a professional school or a liberal arts college, we as citizens in society benefit from being in a society where more people have training and education. If you don't believe me, try going home this afternoon and painting your own car. A few weeks ago on MSNBC, Chris Matthews interviewed Elizabeth Warren, and he tried his best to conduct a "I got you" interview with Warren, which looked a lot like a monkey throwing feces at the zoo, but he kept asking her how much middle-class taxes would go up to pay for Medicare for all. And she made several valiant efforts at explaining how the change would work, but Matthews wouldn't let her finish a sentence. He kept interrupting and demanding, "How much will taxes go up?" And she could never give him a flat-footed answer. Now, since that time, Matthews has told dozens of his guests that he tried to get Warren to admit that taxes would go up by thousands of dollars, but she just wouldn't admit it. Folks, there are moments when I feel like my second calling would be to be a political speechwriter, because I don't think either Warren or Sanders explains democratic socialism very well. But when you are trying to explain Medicare for all to someone like Chris Matthews, you have to break it down into very little pieces, and evidently, you must speak very slowly. If to pay for private health insurance, I have to take $700 a month out of my right pocket, but if we switch to Medicare, I won't pay anything out of my right pocket, but I have to pay $400 out of my left pocket. So yeah, my taxes would go up by $400 a month, but I'm saving $300 a month if you're able to see your left and your right pocket at the same time. So Matthews, yes, your taxes will go up, but you will be saving thousands of dollars on health care every year, even if you don't get sick. But if you do get sick, you discover that Medicare doesn't have that $7,000 deductible that you used to have to pay. So not only will publicly funded healthcare system give you better coverage for half as much money, but also everyone will be covered. Even those desperately poor people that Catholics at least claim they care so much about. As Dr. Cornel West makes so clear in our wisdom lesson today, the United States has always had a blended economy, with some of it being what we call socialist or publicly funded programs, and a lot of it being capitalist or private for-profit systems. My suit, my shoes, my glasses, my shirt, my tie were all made by capitalists. But this morning I woke up to publicly subsidized electricity, lighting and air conditioning my home. I showered and made coffee with publicly subsidized water. I drove here on public streets. Our streets are protected by publicly funded socialist police. Our borders are protected by a publicly funded socialist Army, Air Force, and Navy. And our building here is protected by a socialist fire department. And though I stopped at a capitalist restaurant on my way here, the pork, poultry, dairy, and grain products on my plate were all subsidized crops in one way or another by the public. You know, taxes are always a matter of redistribution of wealth. We use taxes to create a civilization. Sure, we subsidize school lunches. And we should want to feed our kids, but do you know why we started a federal school lunch program? It was started in the 1940s under Harry Truman because military leaders feared that our American school kids were too malnourished to be good soldiers. The military has lately gotten involved in the school lunch debate again because now they think American students are too fat to fight. As a pastor, I would love to see our nation go to universal health coverage because it is the morally right thing to do, to provide health care to sick people, whether they're rich people or poor people, but we will do it because it is cost effective. I wish that we would make college tuition free because we want the children of the poor and the children of the wealthy to have the same access to education and career opportunities as the wealthy. But we will do it because all of these other countries are already doing it. And they will economically beat our butts in the marketplace if we don't start providing tuition-free college. Now, speaking of fake memes, most of you will have heard the 19th century French political philosopher Alexis de Tocqueville quoted as having said that America is great because she is good. If America ceases to be good, America will cease to be great. Sounds really good, but Tocqueville visited America in the 19th century as we were killing all of the Indians in a major genocide and as we were escalating African slavery. De Tocqueville did not think that we were good. In fact, he spoke at length about the irony of how popular churches are in America and how willing we were to be cruel to Indians and black slaves, a kind of social schizophrenia that continues to this day, as we, as a nation full of churches, still appear to be willing to grind the children of the poor up to make the bread for the tables of the rich. He did, however, think that we were hardworking and very ingenious people. I hate to give up on thinking that America could be great because Americans are good, but I have a hope that America could become great again because we're smart, because we realize that some things are done better, more efficiently, and more affordably when they are done through public funding. When everyone gets a living wage, when everyone has access to health care and education and housing, then everyone, the rich and the poor, get to live in a society that is healthier, happier, and smarter. Unlike our president, I actually have been to Denmark. I didn't go to buy Greenland, of course. I went on a rather more obscure goal of visiting the home and the grave of Søren Kierkegaard, which I understand means that I have issues, but that doesn't come as a surprise to anyone. After a frozen slog through the icy slush of Copenhagen, I was warming up over a mug of hot cocoa and met a very attractive young Danish dentist. And when she found out that I was spending my 3 days in Denmark just visiting Kierkegaard memorabilia, she insisted upon giving me a whirlwind tour of Copenhagen. Now, she was an immigrant from Iran, but you could have never met a native-born Dane who had a higher regard for Denmark than she has. We walked through the frozen but very festive Tivoli Gardens, and then the largest open-air mall in the world, featuring many of the classic Danish designs in china and furniture and electronics. And in the midst of this crowded mall, she threw her arms open wide and said, "Do you see any beggars? Do you see anyone who is homeless? Do you see anyone who doesn't even have a good warm coat or good shoes?" She said, "Sure, we have a 50% tax rate, but we have no poverty. We have almost no crime." She said, "I live alone in a house with a view of the ocean, and I drive 2 different Mercedes. Taxes don't matter if you get to live a prosperous life." And she, my friends, is a socialist. But more than that, she's a decent human being who has empathy. And that's what I hope for in America.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.